So Ben, could you please summarize alien bodies and do your very best to not be confusing? Okay, in the prologue, the Third Doctor and Sarah Jane are burying Laika the space dog on a planet somewhere. In the present, the Eighth Doctor plays a chess match with a general who informs him that something has recently been discovered. It's proof that the Doctor can bleed, that he's not immortal. So the general promptly tries to kill the Doctor because he hates him. This thing is in a revit zone in the East Indies. It's being auctioned off in a ziggurat in a hidden city by an alien called Kyoto. Two of the attendees of the auction are soldiers from the UNISYC, future unit. There's also a Time Lord called Homunculate, who has a future model of a TARDIS whose outer shell is humanoid and can talk. Her name is Marie. There's two members of Faction Paradox, a walking dead man called Thrask, a creature called the Shift, who exists as a fictional idea that communicates with people by messing with their perceptions so that they read different words on existing pieces of writing like paper or t-shirts. They can manipulate people by planting thoughts and ideas in their head, but luckily this never comes up later. I think this novel is as dense as it is because everyone involved in this needs at least some context. You can't just present them with just one sentence. They've each got to have their own flashback chapter. But as it goes on, you see the grander picture and you learn a little bit of what was happening to a planet called Dronoid, whose inhabitants got caught up in a war being fought in the future between the Time Lords and a mysterious enemy. Let's talk about the big twist. Turns out that the relic being auctioned off is the Doctor's body in the future. And here's the point where we make awkward eye contact with a lot of Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who scripts. So the Time Lords are losing the war with the enemy in the future because the enemy is capable of erasing people from time and space. They want to use the Doctor's body, use its biodata so they can get all the access codes back to all their old god weapons because he used to be president of Gallifrey. The identity of the enemy is kept somewhat in the dark. Interestingly, the story dismisses the idea of the Daleks being the enemy because they're just too small fry to go up against the Time Lords, which, that aged well. Hey Russ. I recognise this is a somewhat sensitive topic, so let's move on and try not to work out where Russell and Stephen fit on the Somerton scale. I'll just try to stick to my own thoughts on this book as a book. It's very interesting reading this after I've just finished the first Cat's Cradle book from the V&As. The story there was about the danger of the Doctor interacting with Gallifrey's past. Here, it's the future the Doctor's trying to avoid. He's just like me, for real. The character Kyoto really sums up what I like about this. He's an unscrupulous, duplicitous worm man, and he gives this big event with such high stakes, low rent feeling that's very Doctor Who. Kyoto was surrounded by an aura of cheapness that always made his clothes look as though they were trying to slide off his body in disgust. Even his face seemed to have been designed for life in low society, its features knowing they'd never be attractive and settling for a kind of fish-eyed rumpledness instead. He liked to tell himself he looked mature beyond his years. In truth, he looked more like a 30-year-old who'd sold off the next 50 years of his life at bargain basement prices. Not really old, just lacking a future. What a description. Miles is one of those writers with such a clear voice. It's a funny book, but it doesn't feel like it's trying too hard or trying to be Douglas Adams. As a result, I just get such a sense of wry, unique personality from his characters, dialogue, and especially his descriptions. That, more than anything else, was the big draw for me here. Because admittedly, it is a big chunk to get through. On page 173, Kyoto's POV states that he's run out of delaying tactics. I do wonder if that was Lawrence making a little comment about the pacing of the book up until that point. This is my second read of it, and I'm glad because it flowed much better for me this time. I'm not sure how much reviewing I'm going to end up doing here, though. I feel like an easy trap to fall into is just describing all the mad little ideas that this book has. Like, even if you know the big twist and the revival has kinda taken the wind out of your sails with that, there's still so much here. Take the defenses surrounding the Doctor's coffin. They analyze intruders and decide the best way to attack you based on your biodata. In the case of one of the soldiers, Bregman, they trap her in a labyrinth based on her large intestine, where flowers with copies of her face on the end start growing out of the floor to make her feel self-conscious about her appearance. They grow baby versions of Sam, the colour of dried blood. Then there's the surveillance that sees what the leopard was watching half an hour ago by analysing its urine. Or the lap-dancing Rastan warriors. I will commission someone to draw this. Given how the Eighth Doctor's story began with him vowing to hold back death, a thread that one of the previous novels has picked up on, being confronted with his own death is interesting and a logical place to go with that setup. The Doctor has a breaking point when he finds out that Kyoto is someone he's met before. He tries to throttle the guy whilst being manipulated. You get the sense that there's something that bothers him, that even after he's dead, fuckers like this guy are still around, still betraying him. It's like evil's won just by outlasting him. As Miles has written a VNA novel, there are comparisons with the Seventh Doctor, treating him almost like he's been nerfed by the regeneration. Somewhat similar to what Orman and Blum do, 8 is somewhat in denial over the darker aspects of his new personality. This is epitomised with Sam. The defences discover via her biodata that changes were made to her timeline. There was a whole time stream, another life where she never met the Doctor, but then something tweaked her path, replacing that timeline where she turned out completely different, so she'd end up in a situation where she would meet him in the Eight Doctors. And it turns out it's the Doctor who's doing this, at least subconsciously, making incremental changes to one person's life to turn her into the perfect companion. Very in character for 8. What's interesting about this instance, though, is that he didn't do it because he was lonely. It's just on a subconscious level, he understands that having a companion is just the way things are supposed to be. He's acting out of instinct, like, it just makes sense that he has a companion to complete the picture. Every now and then, Sam found herself thinking of the Doctor as a set of responses, not a man. Maybe that was the only way a poxy human mind like hers could come to terms with him, as an equation rather than a living being. Perhaps the worst thing about discovering his own fate is the realization that the Doctor has always been oddly predictable. He's a straight line from A to B. Ultimately, the Doctor's position in the universe and the impact he has on everything around him is being considered here, like it has been before, and like the revival will do over and over again. But in this case, it's less do I have the right, because he doesn't have agency, and maybe he never had it. He's a collection of reactions to everything outside him, now more than ever. It feels like Miles inverting the fact that 8 is more impulsive than 7. It's not just that he's no longer a chess master who can make a real tangible difference. Maybe he never was. One last thing I'll touch on is the faction paradox. This is my first encounter with this lot, apart from Twitter. What's really odd is, in this book, they're just one player amongst many, and they're almost forgotten by the end. But still, they're pretty neat. Magic and science being treated as basically the same principle but with different names was not a new idea by this point, certainly not for Doctor Who, but Miles applying that to the Time Lords to come up with the natural opposite is neat. That said, I know almost nothing about actual voodoo, but even I thought it was a bit weird that this book uses that description interchangeably with devil worship. That ain't great, though it's not just limited to this book or Doctor Who. Thanks, Wikipedia. There's an implication that they're just using aesthetics to make themselves more scary. Like, their belief in the spirits is somewhat put into question, and that does fit in with the novel's preoccupation with window dressing and incongruities between appearance and substance. But to be clear, that's an explanation rather than an excuse. Still, I'm definitely going to be checking out more faction stuff in the future, so please send me any recommendations so I can finally abandon New Who. I don't need you anymore.